Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. Got you covered. Traditional League, Dynasty League, PPR League, IDP League, even Daily Fantasy Football League. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
All right, and welcome to another edition of the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Kenneth Gruenfelder, and we got a great show for you today. So for today's show, we're going to be going through the running backs of each division in the AFC. I'll be doing a rankings of each running back in the AFC. I'll be doing it division by division, just like I did with the NFC. Then we'll be talking about the new combinations in the NFL. I'll be talking about players that switch teams, and I'll be talking about how that impacts fantasy. I'll talk about, how they affect the players that are on their new teams. Then we'll go into our draft analysis of the AFC West, and then we will conclude with the top 10 running backs of 2021, the guys that I think are going to be the best in 2021. So let's get right into the first segment, which is the rankings of each running back in the AFC and do it division by division. So the first division we'll get into is the AFC East. So coming in last in the division, I'm going to say, is the New York Jets. Right now, they signed Tevin Coleman. They drafted Michael Carter out of North Carolina, and they still have LaMichael Pirine, who was another draft pick last year on the roster. That's kind of their running back situation right now. I think I think it is the worst out of every team in the AFC East. The Jets, they're a team that's rebuilding. They did a nice job addressing the offensive line in the draft, and I feel like they're going to be a better team. I just think in terms of their running backs, I think all these guys are really just going to be, for the most part, are going to go undrafted. I did read something that Michael Carter could be somebody that you could potentially draft for your dynasty leagues, obviously because he is a young back coming into the NFL. And I think in terms of dynasty leagues, that's where his value will definitely increase. But when it comes to regular standard fantasy leagues, I think for the most part, all these guys are going to be going undrafted and will be waiver wire pickups. The Jets running back position wasn't, particularly good last year. Le'Veon Bell, the Jets expected big things out of him. And, there was a lot of stuff going on with him and Adam Gase. Adam Gase, supposedly didn't want him on the Jets. And, Le'Veon and the Jets was not a good fit. And LaMichael Pirine, at times, he did show flashes. But, the Jets running back situation is very weak as of right now. But, let's see how it goes during the regular season. There's a new regime. Like I said, they did address the offensive line. There's a new quarterback there. There's a lot of new parts on the Jets now. So, their running back situation could be better. Tevin Coleman has history with Robert Saleh. Obviously, Robert Saleh came over from the 49ers, so there was some familiarity there, and that's why he came to the Jets. Tevin Coleman has proved to be a nice running back when he's healthy, but, that's a problem with him. He's injury-prone, and he gets injured a lot. So, we'll have to see what the Jets' running back situation is, but as of right now, it's probably the worst out of everybody in the division, and there's not a lot of fantasy value you get out of these running backs in terms of standard fantasy leagues. So next is the Buffalo Bills running back situation, and that consists of Devin Singletary and Zach Moss. Now, they're a little bit higher than the Jets, but they're another running back situation where, the running backs really didn't do a lot for the Bills. Josh Allen was arguably the best running back on the team last year. They did have a couple of good games, but, other than that, it's pretty lackluster to say the least. Going through Devin Singletary's stats last year, he had 105 fantasy points in terms of standard leagues, had 687 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. That was a kind of a step down as opposed to what he did in 2019 when he had 775 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns there. He averaged 5.1 yards per carry, and he had 118 fantasy points in 2019. So, yeah, it was a little bit of a dip, but, really hasn't taken that next step that the Bills would have liked in 2020. He did have, a couple of, I guess you could say, semi-decent games. He had 12 points against the Rams, 13 against Vegas. He had 14 against the Broncos. He had a touchdown in that game. And that really came off of a big touchdown run that he had, I think, towards the end of that game. So really didn't do anything special all year in terms of fantasy stats. And you're looking at Zach Moss's numbers. He only had 87.6 fantasy points, had 481 rushing yards, and 4 touchdowns. Really didn't do anything as well. He had one very good game, and that came against the Jets, I believe, in Week 17. I think he had 20 points in that game. So, the running back situation for the Bills really wasn't that good last year. And it didn't really matter because, they were built off of throwing the football and Josh Allen throwing the football to guys like Stephon Diggs. And that's really what their offense was built off of. The running game was kind of, going along for the ride, I guess, if I could put it like that. So hopefully for the Bills' sake, they take the next step and, be more productive. But, in terms of fantasy value, I think those are guys that, I guess people are going to draft them, but, they're probably going to fall late in a lot of drafts. There's not a lot of fantasy value with them as of right now. That could all change this year, but as of right now, I think their fantasy value is low. Then going on to the Miami Dolphins, Myles Gaskin. I think Myles Gaskin could be a solid number 2 running back for your team. Looking at his stats from 2020, had 123 fantasy points, 584 rushing yards, 3 touchdowns, and he had 2 receiving touchdowns. And some of his best games came against the 49ers. He had 15 points in that game. He had 12 points against the Jets. He had 10 against the Rams. He had a touchdown in that game. Had 12 points against the Bengals. His best game came against Vegas when he had 28 points in that contest. He had 2 receiving touchdowns in that game. And then in Week 17 against the Bills, he had 13 points in that game with a rushing touchdown. So, not like, numbers that are going to excite you and be like, you know what, let me take him in the first round. No, but I think he could definitely be a solid number 2 running back in a lot of formats and a lot of leagues. I think that, he's definitely going to be the lead running back down in Miami. And look, this Miami offense can be really good. Like I keep saying, it all hinders on Tua and how Tua is going to develop in year 2. But needless to say, I think Myles Gaskin is a solid pick, in terms of getting him as your number 2 running back. I think in terms of, in the grand scheme of things with the AFC East, I think Miami has the second best running back situation in terms of fantasy value. And then at number 1, I have the Patriots. Now, this is a little bit of a controversial pick, I feel like, because, you don't really know what you're going to get out of the Patriots backfield, from week to week. It's always somebody different, and it's a loaded backfield. And, when you look at the AFC East as a whole, it really doesn't have the best, running backs in terms of talent, and in terms of fantasy value. So it was kind of tough ranking this one, but, I just like the Patriots running back situation just because I feel like in terms of Damian Harris, I feel like he is going to be the lead running back this year in New England. I think that he might be able to take the next step and, be the guy that gets the bulk of the carries. Because, you look at Sony Michel, he's had his injury history, only played in 9 games last year. In 2018, he only played in 13. In 2019, he played in all 16 games. But, last year he was riddled by injuries. And, looking at the statistics for Damian Harris, he only had 86 points last year. Did have a couple of good games. He had 16 points against the Bills in Week 8 with a touchdown. He had 12 against Baltimore in Week 10. And he had 11 against Houston in week 11. But other than that, there really wasn't anything where he, he dropped like 30 or 20 points in a game. He did have a 100-yard rushing game against the Chiefs. He had 10 points in that contest. I forgot to say that in week 4. That was kind of like his, I guess his coming out party, and made people be like, wow, maybe I should pick him up, So, that's his, those are his numbers. I think he could be good. I think the Patriots offense as a whole is going to be better. So I think, the running back situation, it's going to be something to be a little concerned about, because you don't know who it's going to be week to week. But I think Damian Harris can take over and be the lead running back in New England. Because I think really his only competition in terms of being a 3-down back is Sony Michel. And Sony Michel did not have a good season last year. Like I talked about it, he dealt with injuries, so he was out a lot, only played in 9 games. He only had 68 points. And that is a huge drop compared to what he did in the previous 2 seasons when he had 140 points in 2019, and 132 points in 2018. So like I said, there was a huge drop-off in terms of fantasy points from those previous 2 years to 2020. And then looking at the final running back, you got James White. Only had 67 points last year. In the last 2 years, he had 128 points in 2019, and in 2018 he had 189 fantasy points. So I don't know how he's going to do, but, sometimes, his value could go up a little bit. He could be a nice streamer option, from week to week, especially in PPR. I think that's really where his value is the best, is obviously PPR, because he's a pass catcher, coming out of the backfield. So that's kind of where his value is. In terms of where these guys are going to get drafted, I think Damian Harris probably has the best fantasy value out of these running backs. I think James White's second, and I think Sony Michel is probably third, just because of Sony Michel being banged up last year. I think because of the PPR stuff that I talked about with James White, I think his value is a little bit higher than Sony Michel, and I think Damian Harris is probably the best out of the 3. But yeah, I don't know. I just feel like Damian Harris is probably going to be the best running back out of the running backs that I talked about in the AFC East. I could be wrong. It's probably, between him and Myles Gaskin as of right now. You probably give the nod to Gaskin, but, I think most people would give the nod to Gaskin, but I don't know. I feel like Damian Harris could be the best one. So that's my rankings for the AFC East. So moving on now to the AFC North. In last, I have Najee Harris. Now, this is not a knock on Najee Harris as a player. This is what's, going on around him. The Steelers' offensive line, wasn't good last year, basically towards the end of last year, and the Steelers really were one of the worst teams at running the football last year. And I got to see what their offensive line is like. If their offensive line is good this year, then then Harris is going to go up a little bit in the running back rankings. But I think as of right now, I'd probably have him last just because of the question marks at the offensive line for the Steelers. They did address some of it in the draft, but I'd have to see how they actually play once we get to the preseason and the regular season. Then in third, I have J.K. Dobbins. Honestly, going from the AFC East to the AFC North, the running backs are loaded in this division, and it is kind of hard to pick and choose. I think number 1 was probably the easiest to pick, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But J.K. Dobbins, he's going to be the number 1 running back in Baltimore. I think he's going to have a good season. The Ravens, they love to run the football, and that's what's going to make his value go up this year. And especially because now Mark Ingram's not there, I think that's going to increase his value even more. I could definitely see him having a really good season. I think he's a solid number 2 running back. I would say borderline number 1, but I'd feel more comfortable saying he's a number 2 running back when it comes to fantasy. Then you got Joe Mixon at 2 in the AFC North. This guy was really good. The previous 2 seasons before 2020 when he dealt with an ankle injury, he was banged up the whole year. I think he can have a really good season. It's just we got to see how the Bengals' offensive line is. If the Bengals' offensive line's not good, there's going to be problems. And hopefully he stays healthy because he could be a dynamic playmaker for this offense. He's a borderline number 1 fantasy running back. Another solid number 2. But definitely, if you have him as a number 1 running back, that's not too bad either. Just he's got to stay healthy. And then, of course, you have Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt at number 1. Nick Chubb, he had an injury last year in Week 4, missed a couple games, but he was fantastic last year. And the fact that the Browns are able to balance, Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt and get them their respective stats is very impressive. They're the best 1-2 punch in the NFL in terms of running backs. I think Nick Chubb is a solid number 1 running back. I had him last year. Kareem Hunt, he could be a solid number 2, solid flex option, but I think when it comes to Nick Chubb, he's probably the best running back out of the running backs that I just named. And I think Nick Chubb, his stock is going to go up this year. I think he's a top 5 fantasy pick. That's a little controversial, but I think he could do that, even with splitting time with Kareem Hunt, because I think that the Browns are able to do it well enough that Nick Chubb gets his points, even with splitting time with Kareem Hunt. So that's my ranking of the AFC North running backs. Then moving on to the AFC South. Coming in last, you got Phillip Lindsay, Mark Ingram, David Johnson. I mean, the Texans are a mess. I talk about it pretty much on every show. They're a mess. We don't really know who the lead running back is going to be. I mean, I guess it's going to be Phillip Lindsay, because I think David Johnson, he was okay last year. But, I think Lindsay's the younger running back, and I think he's probably going to get the bulk of the carries, But overall, it's just a loaded backfield. I mean, you got all these 3 guys in there. They were all good fantasy options at some point in their career. But, I don't really know what to expect from them. But I think it's going to be pretty bad for them. So I don't really expect anybody to draft any of these guys, unless it's in the later rounds. I'm not really high on Mark Ingram. I think Mark Ingram is probably going to be the guy that gets the least amount of carries. Somebody, if it's not Mark Ingram, somebody's definitely going to fade out and really just be the forgotten man in this loaded backfield. I mean, if this backfield was from like 2016, because I had Mark Ingram and David Johnson on my team in 2016, and I won that league that year, but now it's 2021. These guys are not what they were, back then. Phillip Lindsay, he's still got a solid career ahead of him, hopefully. But these guys, they're not what they once were. So I don't really have a lot of faith in this running back situation. The fantasy value is very low when it comes to these guys. Then moving on, you got James Robinson and Carlos Hyde. Now, I didn't include Travis Etienne because now they seem to be trying him out at wide receiver, the Jaguars, and that kind of changes my opinion on the running back situation, because if they put Etienne now at wide receiver, now that gives James Robinson an increased fantasy value again. Carlos Hyde is probably going to be somebody that is on the waiver wire, because I think James Robinson is going to get the bulk of the carries, but, if injuries happen, Carlos Hyde could be a guy that, a hot waiver wire pickup, because he was that last year when Chris Carson got hurt when he was playing for the Seahawks. So then moving on, you got Jonathan Taylor. I rant and rave about this guy. Really had a solid second half of the season when he was deemed the lead running back in Indianapolis. He runs behind a very talented offensive line. I think now a full year as being the number 1 back in Indianapolis, he's going to be a top fantasy option. I could definitely see him maybe going towards the end of the first round. I think he's definitely a second-round pick, if not a second-round, third-round pick. I think he's going to be really solid this year. And then, of course, you got Derrick Henry at number 1. I mean, he's going to be a top 3 pick again this year. You got to worry about, like I've talked about, the playoff performance that he had against the Ravens. That's something to be concerned about. But I think he's going to be solid again. And like I always say with all these guys, as long as they stay healthy, they're going to be solid. That guy's a bowling ball. He's hard to take down. He's going to have one of those 200-yard rushing games once again. He's going to have another solid season. And then moving on, finally, to the AFC West. So in last, I have Melvin Gordon. He was okay last year for the Broncos. Didn't really do anything that amazing, that impressive. But, he did have a couple good games. He did have the game against the Jets. He had 23 points, but yes, it was against the Jets, but who cares? It's fantasy. He had 20 points against the Bills in Week 15. Those were his only 20-point games in fantasy. He wasn't what he was with the Chargers when he was like a top 5 running back. So I probably put him in last. Then moving on, you got Josh Jacobs. Talking to some people, they weren't really happy with what Josh Jacobs did last year. He played in 15 games, had 198 fantasy points, so he increased, the amount of games he played, because he only played in 13 in 2019, and he had 171 fantasy points in 2019. So, he increased the amount of points that he had. He had 31 points in Week 1. He had 20 points against the Chiefs in Week 5. He had 25 points in Week 10 against the Broncos. He had 17 against the Chargers in Week 15, and he had 20 points again against the Broncos in Week 17. So he did have a couple good games, really good games. But I think it's because of the games where he had 2 points, 7 points, 3 points, 7 points, and 6 points. That's not very good coming from a running back. So I think that's where the complaints are, the inconsistency that he brings to the table at times. But I think he could be a solid running back. He's definitely a solid number 2 running back if you get him. Then I got Clyde Edwards-Helaire at 2. The reason why I have him there is just because of what the Chiefs were able to do in the offseason to improve that offensive line. I think he's going to be the lead running back there. Le'Veon Bell is no longer there. The Chiefs, like I said, the Chiefs' offensive line is improved now. I think the Chiefs, like the Bills, they like to throw the ball a lot more than they run it, obviously. The Chiefs are built on the passing game. And you know what? Clyde Edwards-Helaire can, catch the ball out of the backfield as well. I think with the improved offensive line and, the fact that he plays in the Chiefs' offense, I think he can have a good season. I'm not going to say he's going to do amazing, but, I think that he's maybe a little bit above Josh Jacobs in terms of fantasy value. Because, going through the projections last year, he was supposed to go, top 6 or something like that. He's projected to be a first-round pick, and he really did not live up to that. So his stock is definitely going to be down this year. But I think he could potentially be, the second-best running back in this division in terms of fantasy. And then you got Austin Eckler, only played in 10 games last year. He had 111 fantasy points, and compared to what he did in 2019, he had 217 in 2019, so he was amazing in 2019. Like I said, only played in 10 games. I think if he stays healthy, in terms of PPR, he has the best value out of any running back in this division. If he stays healthy, yeah, he has the best value out of any running back in this division in terms of standard leagues too. So he plays in an offense that's going to be really good this year. The Chargers, they have a lot of weapons, and, Herbert's going to be better protected this year. They made improvements on the offensive line. If he stays healthy, he's going to be really good. So, I think Eckler, he could be taken in the 3rd, 4th round this year. So that's my opinion on the AFC West, and that is my opinion on all the running backs in each division in the AFC. So with that, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the new combinations in the NFL. We're going to talk about players that switch teams and how they're going to impact the players on their new teams and, how that's going to impact fantasy in terms of, the draft stock for guys. Is their draft stock going to go up or down and all that good stuff. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 2 of the show. We're going to talk about the new combinations in the NFL. So we're going to go through some players that change teams, and we're going to talk about how it's going to impact the players that are already on the teams that these players went to. So let's get right into it. So with the first combination that I want to talk about is Matthew Stafford going to the Rams to pair up with Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp. Now, Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods have been very solid players in fantasy. They're guys that get taken in the, about the 3rd, 4th rounds. each year, maybe a little bit later on. But they're both very productive at their respective spots. And they've had Jared Goff throwing them the football the past couple of seasons. But I just think that with Matthew Stafford now, I think this elevates their draft stock. And I think, for Matthew Stafford, he's going into a situation where he has a better offensive line, he's got a better running game, and he's got better receivers. And I've talked about a lot, on the past couple of shows, that this is arguably his best supporting cast. And I think the Rams are poised to have a very good season. And I think that when it comes to fantasy, Matthew Stafford is a quarterback that I think a lot of people got to definitely consider taking, if he's available to you. Now, I think there's quarterbacks that are higher than him. I did talk about the top 10 quarterbacks when it comes to fantasy going into this season, and he's on that list. But I do think that there are quarterbacks that are better than him out there. But if he's available to you, I think you should definitely consider taking him. And, along with that, like I said, Robert Woods and Cooper Kupp's draft stock, I think, is going to go up this year. And all these guys got to stay healthy, of course, and I talk about that a lot. I think that, Robert Woods, I think, is the more consistent option when it comes to fantasy, but I think these guys are both solid. And I think with Matthew Stafford now as the quarterback, this is going to elevate their draft stock. And I think this is going to be a very successful combination. Whether you're talking about Matthew Stafford throwing to Robert Woods or Matthew Stafford throwing to Cooper Kupp, it's going to be a great combination either way. So that's my thoughts on that new combination in LA. So the next combination is Daniel Jones and Kenny Golladay. Now, this is a very great acquisition that the Giants made in the offseason. The Giants the last couple of seasons really needed a number one wide receiver, a guy that can go up and get those 50-50 balls. And, you go back into the past, you talk about guys like Hakeem Nicks and Plexico Burress. Those were big wide receiver guys that, could go up and make those big plays. And, the Giants have been missing that receiver for the last couple of seasons. Odell Beckham Jr., very good, but, he's not a big, tall guy that can go get those 50-50 balls. He's a great route runner, and, his thing is built off of speed. His talent's built off of speed and getting himself open. He's not that guy that's going to go up and get those contested passes that are thrown his way. Not to knock him, but that's just, the type of player that Odell is. But talking about Golladay, I think this is a good signing for them. I think in terms of fantasy, I think this is going to help Daniel Jones a lot. I think this is a huge year for Daniel Jones when it comes to, real life. And, I think that he could be somewhat of a good fantasy option. Depending on what the matchup is, I think he's going to be a, more of a streaming option. And, like I always talk about with my 2 QB league that I do, he could potentially be a guy that's, that third QB on your roster. But I think this is only going to help Daniel Jones a lot. The thing that I'm worried about is Golladay, because Golladay has, he's been banged up the past couple of years. He has missed some time, especially last year due to injury. That's the one thing that I'm concerned about. But, in terms of fantasy now, I think Golladay, he's a guy that's probably going to get taken, in the mid-rounds, just because of the unknowns with Daniel Jones, because it's a big year for Daniel Jones, and a lot of people are expecting him to do big things, especially with the guys that they added on the offensive side of the ball. Along with Golladay, you got Kadarius Toney, who they drafted out of Florida, the wide receiver, and they brought in John Ross and Kyle Rudolph. That's only going to help out what the Giants have already there, and Evan Ingram, who's, not a lot of people are fans of him right now because of the problems he has with the drops. And, of course, you had Sterling Shepard and Darius Slayton there as well, and Saquon Barkley is coming back. I just think the sky's the limit for this offense. It all just hinders on the quarterback. I think if Daniel Jones is protected, I think he's going to do really well. I think he should do really well. He threw 20-something touchdowns back in 2019, his rookie season. He only had 11 his second season. And you know what? It's because he was learning a new system, that has a lot to do with it. And the offensive line wasn't the best, last year. It got better as the season went on, but it was ranked at the bottom. When I was looking at a Pro Football Focus, it was like, I think it was 31st according to Pro Football Focus. It was at the bottom, But as a Giant fan, as we watch the season progress. The blocking did get better, particularly in the run game. I think really the biggest thing with the Giants is the offensive line. If the offensive line is good, I think this team's going to be good. Daniel Jones, he cut down on the turnovers. I think that's big. And the big thing with Galladay's a red zone target as well. He led the league in touchdown receptions, I believe, a couple of years ago. So, I think that coupled with the Giants, and having all those weapons, I think that's going to really help, both of these players. So I'm interested to see what they're going to do together. I think if Daniel Jones is healthy and, he plays well, I think this combination is going to be really good. So there's that combination. Then you got Ryan Fitzpatrick going to Washington to pair up with Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel. Curtis Samuel obviously came over from the Carolina Panthers. He has some familiarity with Ron Rivera as the head coach of the Washington football team. And with Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think he's probably the most explosive quarterback that Terry McLaurin will be playing with up until this point. He's played with Alex Smith, he's played with Dwayne Haskins, Taylor Heineke, Kyle Allen. I think Ryan Fitzpatrick is the most explosive quarterback that Terry McLaurin is going to be playing with up until this point of his career. And I think he's going to benefit from that tremendously. We've seen Ryan Fitzpatrick have games where, he's thrown for a lot of yards, a lot of touchdowns, and then he'll have games where he's really bad and throws a lot of interceptions. And that is not something that should be ignored. But Ryan Fitzpatrick could be productive in this offense. Age is a factor, and he's not, getting any younger. But I think that he has, maybe one or two quality seasons left in him, if he continues to play at the level that he's capable of playing at, so... And I also think that this could be, arguably one of his best supporting casts as well that he's been paired up with. Logan Thomas was a top 10 fantasy tight end last year, I believe. So add him into the mix. Curtis Samuel was a quality wide receiver last year. I had him in a couple of my leagues, and he was very solid, a solid flex option, number 2 wide receiver. Especially, when I needed him to be implemented into my lineup when I had guys on bye weeks or guys were injured, or my team was lacking and I needed to pick somebody up and he happened to be there. I think Curtis Samuel, this is a great opportunity for him. He was the odd man out, when it came to Carolina, because you had Robbie Anderson and DJ Moore both there, and it was tough for him to get some opportunities. He was taking some handoffs out of the backfield, while Christian McCaffrey was out. So this guy could be a dynamic player, and he could be a pretty good fantasy option, especially now with Ryan Fitzpatrick. I think when Ryan Fitzpatrick is on, he could be a solid fantasy option, and I think if he's consistent and he doesn't turn the ball over constantly like he does have a habit of doing, I think Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel and Logan Thomas, those guys on that offense, their draft stock has the potential of going up in a lot of fantasy drafts as well. So that's my thoughts on those new combinations. Then you got Jared Goff and T.J. Hawkinson. Now, T.J. Hawkinson was a top 10 fantasy tight end last year, and I think that Jared Goff is, a downgrade from Matthew Stafford, obviously. But the one thing that I think that benefits T.J. Hawkinson is I think he's going to be Jared Goff's number 1 target in this offense because, now there's no more Marvin Jones and there's no more Kenny Galladay, so really it's kind of T.J. Hawkinson and a bunch of unknowns, really. They did draft a wide receiver in the draft, and, they did bring in some guys. They signed Tyrell Williams, who recently played with the Raiders, but I don't even think he played at all last year. So there's a lot of unknowns at the wide receiver spot. So T.J. Hawkinson is going to be the number 1 option for Jared Goff. And one thing that I looked up and found on Pro Football Focus is that Goff the last 2 seasons has really utilized his tight ends a lot, particularly when you talk about guys like Gerald Everett and Tyler Higbee. And according to Pro Football Focus, he targeted the tight end position at a 22% clip, which ranks 10th highest since 2019. And Jared Goff also ranked 5th in passing yards and 5th in total attempts to tight ends, and this is according to Pro Football Focus. And I think this could benefit T.J. Hawkinson a lot. I think he's a solid tight end. I just think that, he was kind of lost, in this offense because, you had guys like Marvin Jones and Kenny Galladay who, took targets away from him, and I believe Hawkinson was injured a couple of times, but, he could be a solid fantasy tight end if, he's targeted. And I think now in this offense, he has the potential to do that based off of, what I just talked about with what Pro Football Focus said about Jared Goff. Jared Goff loves to use his tight ends, and TJ Hawkinson can definitely benefit from that. However, there's a downside to it. He's the only weapon on the offense. TJ Hawkinson's the only guy on the offense that's actually doing anything. You're going to have defenses, paying close attention to that and making sure that TJ Hawkinson doesn't have an impact on the game and take him out of the game. So then he ends up doing nothing for the offense. And then also you got to talk about, the offensive line for the Lions as well. They did draft Penei Sewell out of Oregon, and he was arguably the best offensive line in the draft. So Jared Goff is going to have some sort of protection this upcoming season, but it's not going to be as good as it was with the Rams. The Rams' offensive line is a really good unit, and Matthew Stafford's going to get a lot of help from it. But, Jared Goff going from that situation in LA to Detroit is kind of a massive downgrade. Let's see how the Lions are. I'm hoping Jared Goff does good. We'll see what happens. But I think TJ Hawkinson has the potential to have a really solid fantasy season as long as, he's not shut down and he's not the only option on this offense and Jared Goff is somewhat protected. Jared Goff is going to target him a lot. He likes using his tight end, so that is, a plus. So that's kind of my thoughts on that situation in Detroit. All right, so then we got Tua Tagovailoa along with Will Fuller and Jalen Waddle. They brought Will Fuller, the Dolphins, over from the Texans. He'll miss a couple of games due to his suspension. And then you got Jalen Waddle, the wide receiver that the Dolphins took out of Alabama. I think this could definitely be great for Tua. I mean, I think he's in a similar situation like Daniel Jones where, this is the year for him to develop and become, the franchise quarterback if he wants to be that. Last year you had the Dolphins taking out Tua and putting in Ryan Fitzpatrick as some sort of relief pitcher, if Tua wasn't playing particularly well and, really did not play well in that Week 17 matchup against the Bills where Miami really needed to win that game to make the playoffs. I think Tua could definitely be, a guy that a lot of people are going to draft this year, particularly in 2 QB leagues. I think he's a guy that could be taken as like the third QB. Like Daniel Jones, I just really have a hard time believing that Tua cannot succeed with all the weapons that he has at his disposal. I think that, maybe it's going to be one of those things where, there's some growing pains in year one and, you struggle a little bit. But I think I could see him really, taking a big step just because of the weapons that he is going to have around him. Now, he's not going to have Will Fuller in the beginning because of the suspension, but, he already has, a past with Jalen Waddle. He could develop that chemistry once again. You have Devontae Parker there, you have Mike Gesicki there, and once Will Fuller comes back, I mean, that offense could be really good. It just all hinders on the quarterback position of the Dolphins. And, if Tua's really good, then, I could definitely see, Jalen Waddle and Will Fuller being, hot waiver wire pickups. I think Will Fuller is going to be a guy, along with Jalen Waddle, they're going to be taken more towards, the, later rounds. And, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Tua, there's a lot of question marks surrounding Tua. And, people don't really know how he's going to do this year. I mean, I think he could do well. Now he's another year removed from that hip injury that he sustained, and now he's got more weapons surrounding him, to go with Devontae Parker and Mike Gesicki. So I think he could do well. If Tua does well and, if somehow Will Fuller is not, drafted, he could be a hot waiver wire pickup. And Jalen Waddle could definitely be, a flex option, if he's, productive in that offense along with Tua. So, I could see, there being a lot of positives with this offense if Tua does well. So that's my thoughts on that combination. Then moving on, you got Kyler Murray and A.J. Green. So A.J. Green was brought over from the Cincinnati Bengals. The Cardinals have a lot of veterans on this team now. They got J.J. Watt. They brought him over. Now A.J. Green, another guy that they brought over as well. They signed Matt Prater to be their kicker. They got a lot of veterans. And I think this could be another combination that works out well because, A.J. Green doesn't have to step in and be the number one option. You got DeAndre Hopkins there, and a lot of defenses are going to have their focus on DeAndre Hopkins, and that's going to open up the door for A.J. Green to have more opportunities. And, he's another guy that's going to be another year removed from his injuries, so maybe he'll have a little bit of juice left in the tank to have a productive season. So that's my thoughts on that combination. Then you got Sam Darnold being paired up with Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore. I didn't include Robbie Anderson just because he's already had, chemistry with Robbie Anderson at the pro level. It's kind of different because Tua and Waddle, they were, they had a prior connection in the college level. I don't know if that logic is, good or not, but that's why I left Robbie Anderson out here. But you could throw him in there as well. I just had Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore here. But yeah, I mean, this is the best supporting cast Sam Darnold is going to be playing with up until this point of his career. And I think it could work out very well for Sam Darnold if he makes, the corrections with turnovers and, he's better protected as well. If he does that, then, I think the sky's the limit for this offense. This offense can be particularly good, and he could be a solid starter. And, Christian McCaffrey and DJ Moore, their numbers are going to really hinder on what the quarterback position does. Christian McCaffrey, we've seen how he does, with Kyle Allen at quarterback. So I think he could do well with Sam Darnold, and also he's coming off of an injury, and I think that, he's going to be wanting to prove himself. But we'll see how he does, Sam Darnold with DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson. I think Robbie Anderson and him are going to be fine because they've had a connection, on the Jets, and they were pretty good together. So we'll see what happens with that. Then you got Josh Allen and Emmanuel Sanders. I think this could be really good. This is one of the most explosive quarterbacks that Emmanuel Sanders has ever played with. And, defenses are going to have all their focus on Stephon Diggs, and I think that's going to open the door up for more opportunities for Emmanuel Sanders. Cole Beasley could steal some targets away from him. But you know what? I think that Emmanuel Sanders could be a solid fantasy option, for your bench, a guy that can be taken in the later rounds. Because injuries can happen as well. So if Cole Beasley, he gets injured, he's been banged up a lot. Emmanuel Sanders could get more opportunities there. Then you got Cam Newton with all of his free agent acquisitions, Nelson Aguilar, Hunter Henry, Jonnu Smith, and Kendrick Bourne. I think it really all hinders on the quarterback position. If Cam, is better this year, this offense can be really good, So we'll have to wait and see what happens with that. I think the tight ends, I have more confidence in the tight ends than I do in the receivers just because, the Patriots love to use the tight ends. And, they got the two, arguably the best tight ends on the market. And I think a lot of people are going to be drafting them, in their fantasy leagues. Then I got a bunch of rookies combinations. I got Joe Burrow with Jamar Chase, Matt Ryan with Kyle Pitts, and, the list goes on and on with that. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase, they got, chemistry together. They played with each other in LSU, and I think Jamar Chase can be very explosive for this offense. I think it all depends on Joe Burrow's health and the offensive line. If Joe Burrow's protected, he showed he could play at the pro level. And, if he's got more weapons and he's protected, I think he's going to be good. So there's that. Matt Ryan with Kyle Pitts, this could be really good. You could pair him up with Julio Jones and Calvin Ridley, and Matt Ryan loves to throw to the tight ends. You go back to the years with Tony Gonzalez. That could be a great combination there. Jalen Hurts with Devontae Smith. A lot of people are talking about, the size of Devontae Smith, but listen, he won the Heisman Trophy. Let's see how he does at the pro level. I mean, I think that's going to be Jalen Hurts' go-to guy. I think if, he answers the critics of his size, he could be very good and productive in this offense. The Eagles' offense, let's see what they can do. And then you got, what I got here is Lamar Jackson along with Rashad Bateman and Sammy Watkins. The Ravens drafted Rashad Bateman, a big wide receiver that, Lamar Jackson really needs, and hopefully he can, help out that offense. And Sammy Watkins is a guy, look, and when it comes to fantasy, can have one of those games where he drops, 43 points, like in week 1 in 2019 against the Jaguars. So I think, Sammy Watkins is probably someone that's going to go undrafted along with Rashad Bateman. We'll have to wait and see. The Ravens' passing game was really bad last year. They didn't have a receiver that went over 1,000 yards. So I think the offense for the Ravens will be better, now that they've addressed the wide receiver spot. Now you got Aaron Rodgers with Amari Rodgers. Amari Rodgers was one of Trevor Lawrence's top weapons at Clemson. If Aaron Rodgers does play, I think he's going to utilize Amari Rodgers well. because the Packers have needed a wide receiver over the past couple of seasons, so we'll see how that goes. Then you got Justin Fields / Andy Dalton with Allen Robinson. I think, either way, Allen Robinson can be productive. He did play, with Blake Bortles, back in the day with Jacksonville, and he played with Mitchell Trubisky the past couple of seasons. So I think he can be productive with both quarterbacks here. We'll have to wait and see what he looks like. But, I think Justin Fields is the more explosive option. Andy Dalton, we know what he is. But I think Andy Dalton could be solid, a solid backup. But, I think in terms of fantasy, Allen Robinson is probably going to get taken a lot lower than he has in the years past. Probably in, maybe the 5th or 6th round, I want to say. I don't really know. We'll have to wait and see with that. Then I just got Justin Herbert with Jared Cook. I think Jared Cook, he's had years where he's been a monster, especially with the Raiders. I think Herbert's a guy that's going to be really, really good this year, and he's got a lot of weapons around him. And Jared Cook, I think, could benefit from that. I think this is one of the best quarterbacks of Jared Cook I think it really has ever played with, along with Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees. So let's see how that goes. So those are all the new combinations in the NFL that I wanted to talk about. So with that, we're going to take another quick break. When we come back, we're going to do a draft analysis of the AFC West. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast for segment number 3. We're going to do a draft analysis of the AFC West. So let's get started with that. So we're going to go, obviously, from the team that finished in last to first, like I've been doing with all of these. So the team that finished in last in the division was the Denver Broncos. So going through the guys on the Broncos that I think you're going to want to have on your fantasy teams, one of them is Drew Lock. I think in terms of 2 QB leagues, I think he's a guy you could potentially have as your third QB. But the thing that's really interesting is now the Broncos brought in Teddy Bridgewater. And, listen, if Drew Lock does not play well, because the Broncos expected big things out of this guy when they drafted him a couple years ago, and he really hasn't delivered, he's been injured, if he doesn't play well, they're going to get rid of him. So he is a little bit of a risk. Now, in terms of the other guys on this team, you got Melvin Gordon. I think he's a guy that, he could ride your bench. He could be a flex option. You got Cortland Sutton coming back. The thing with him is the injury that he came off of. He tore his ACL last year. So that's a little bit concerning. But I think that regardless of who he plays with Drew Lock or Teddy Bridgewater, I think he's going to be successful. I think he could be a solid number 2 wide receiver on your team or a flex option. I think he's a guy that's going to be taken later in drafts this year just because of the injury that he's coming off of. Then you got Noah Fant. A lot of people were expecting big things out of him last year, and he really didn't deliver. So I don't really know what to expect of him. I always talk about how thin the tight end position really is, when it comes to fantasy, and there's really only three tight ends that I feel very confident about getting in my fantasy leagues. George Kittle, Travis Kelce, and Darren Waller. Outside of that, it's a lot of question marks. There is a couple of other good tight ends, but those are the three that I feel the most confident about taking in fantasy drafts. But with Noah Fant, let's see how he is this year. You could argue that, there was a lot of, switching around at the quarterback position. Drew Lock wasn't always playing. You had Brett Rippon in there. You had Jeff Driscoll in there. Drew Lock wasn't always playing, so, and then at one point they had the COVID outbreak. So, they had to have a guy, come in and play quarterback for them in one game, and he only completed one pass. And that was Kendall Hinton, who completed only one pass in that game, and arguably enough, that was Noah Fant that he completed the pass to. They did a tight end screen there. So there was inconsistent QB play last year. You had guys like Courtland Sutton, who was injured for the whole year pretty much. KJ Hamler, another receiver that they drafted, he was injured or missed a couple games. Jerry Jeudy, I think, missed a couple games as well. So, there was a lot of inconsistency last year with the Broncos, and hopefully they stay healthy this year. And if they stay healthy and they get consistent quarterback play, maybe Noah Fant finally breaks out and is that tight end that everybody's expecting. He's still young. So, let's see what he can do. And then you got Jerry Jeudy. I think he's another guy. If they get consistent QB play, he could be pretty good. I think he's a guy that can ride on your bench. He could be a flex option. We'll have to wait and see what he does, because a lot of people were expecting him to do really good last year, and he really didn't do that well. But yeah, I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that there was a lot of, inconsistent QB play. So then, moving on, you got the team that finished in third place, and that was the Los Angeles Chargers. So I think right off the bat, obviously, Justin Herbert is going to be one of the top QBs in fantasy this year. I believe that because, he's got good weapons around him, and they address the offensive line. They were one of the worst offensive lines last year. And there was a game against the Patriots, they lost 45-0. So I think I don't see that happening again. And I think the Chargers and the Patriots play again this year. I think I might have talked about it on one of my previous shows, but, needless to say, I think Herbert's going to have a really good year. I think he's going to have an even better season than he did last year, because now, he's got all these weapons around him, and like I talked about with the running backs, Austin Eckler hopefully is healthy the whole year, and Keenan Allen, put everybody back on notice, made him a top 15, top 20 wide receiver, in fantasy. So, I think that, they also brought in Jared Cook, and they got Mike Williams there as well. So he's going to have to learn a new playbook. Obviously, the Chargers did change head coaches. But you know what? I think that, he'll be able to learn the playbook, and he'll have a successful season. Like I said, I think he's probably going to be, a top 3 fantasy quarterback this year. He's definitely somebody I'm going to be looking to draft early on in some of the fantasy leagues that I do. And I think he's going to be really good. I think he's going to throw, about 40 touchdowns, maybe 40 plus. So you got Herbert. Then, you got Austin Eckler. I think if he comes back and he's healthy, he's going to be a PPR stud. He is definitely going to be somebody that's going to fall in the late second round, third round, possibly fourth round. That's probably where he's going to fall around in terms of a lot of fantasy drafts. I think he's a solid number 2 running back. You could probably pass with him as a number 1 running back, particularly in PPR leagues, but I would feel a lot more confident with him if he was my number 2 running back, because of the fact that he's coming off an injury as well. And, honestly, I don't think really him and Herbert have developed, a connection yet. I think in year 2 with them together, I think it'll be better, and I think with him being healthy, there'll be more continuity, and, he'll put up better numbers this year, than he did last year. So you got Austin Eckler. Then, of course, you have Jared Cook. Jared Cook with the Saints, he was okay. He did lay a couple of goose eggs last year for me in fantasy. And you know what? He might do the same thing with the Chargers, but I don't know. I feel like with the young guy like Herbert, Jared Cook's numbers are going to go up. I think Herbert, him with his second year in the league, as opposed to, Drew Brees on, really his last legs, I think that's going to make a huge difference for Jared Cook's production and his fantasy value. I think his fantasy value is going to go up a little bit this year. I probably wouldn't draft him, for me, just because I wasn't happy with his production last year. But I think he has the potential, if he goes undrafted, to be a hot waiver wire pickup if he's productive in this offense. He was pretty good with the Raiders, and he was good with the Packers in that lone season that he was with the Packers. So I could definitely see, and not to say that he wasn't productive with the Saints. He did have good games. It's just, it would just be very inconsistent. But I think in this offense, he could be pretty good, and maybe his fantasy value will increase a little bit. With Mike Williams, I think he's probably going to be a guy that's going to go undrafted in a lot of leagues. He does have an injury history. But you know what? Hey, he has games where he does very good. But, he's not very consistent. And, him being the number 2 option, at the wide receiver spot, I feel like he should be better. But I think it's just because I don't know. I mean, he's just inconsistent. And injuries, I think that really affects him. I think, like I said, for the most part, he's probably going to go undrafted. But then you got Keenan Allen. I think Keenan Allen is somebody that's going to go in the 4th, 5th round this year. I think he can have an even better season this year with Herbert again. I just think that Herbert is a very explosive quarterback, and, he's definitely a huge upgrade over what they had in Phillip Rivers the last couple of seasons. I think Keenan Allen could be a top wide receiver again. I think he could be a solid number 1 wide receiver in fantasy. If not number 1, definitely number 2. And really, this offense as a whole is going to be very explosive because of Justin Herbert. And if all these guys are healthy, I think all these guys' fantasy values are going to be up there. They're going to increase, because of Herbert. They just got to stay healthy, guys like Mike Williams. And hopefully Jared Cook could be a consistent option at tight end, because Jared Cook, he replaces Hunter Henry in this offense. I think the people that I feel the most confident about out of the 5 players that I named is Eckler, Keenan Allen, and Herbert, of course. I think Mike Williams, like I said, is probably going to be a waiver wire pickup, if somebody gets injured. And Jared Cook's probably going to be a waiver wire pickup as well. Definitely could be your backup tight end on your roster as well, but I'd probably stay away from drafting him as your tight end 1. So those are my thoughts on the Chargers players. So now moving on to the Raiders, we got Derek Carr, Darren Waller, Henry Ruggs, and Josh Jacobs. So, let's talk about Derek Carr first. So Derek Carr had his best fantasy season in 2020. He had 272 fantasy points. That's the most of his career. And he averaged about 17 points per game, which is really good. He passed for over 4,000 yards. He had 27 touchdowns to 9 interceptions. Had a very good season, in the 16 games that he played in. And going through some of his best games, he had 21 points against the Saints in Week 2. He had 20 points against the Bills in Week 4, 23 against the Chiefs in Week 5, had 21 against the Chiefs in Week 11 again. 31 points against the Jets in Week 13, 23 against the Colts in Week 14, 23 against Miami in Week 16, and then 20 in Week 17 against the Broncos. So there were a lot of good games here. I think he's a solid QB option, particularly in 2 QB leagues. I think he's a solid number 2 quarterback. I think he could be a solid number 1 QB in leagues as well. But for me, I personally feel more confident with him as being my number 2 quarterback. I think that he is going to be the long-term guy for the Raiders. I think he proved that last year because they did bring in Marcus Mariota. And you know what? Derek Carr had a really nice year. He really did. I think the offensive line is a little bit of an issue going into this season. They did lose some guys on the offensive line, so hopefully they could protect Derek Carr. But you know what? I think going into this year, I think the Raiders' offense is still going to be pretty good, and I think that he is a solid QB option this year. He's definitely somebody you can get in the later rounds. He's not going to be one of the first QBs taken off the board, but you know what? I could definitely see him being taken towards the end of a lot of drafts. Because of what the QB position is now in fantasy leagues. Everybody loads up on QBs towards the end of drafts now, and that's probably where he's going to go. He's not going to be the top QB that's taken off the board. But listen, if he's there and you're desperate for a QB2 or a QB3 or, and I'm talking about 2 QB leagues, but if you need a backup QB, in your 1 QB leagues, he's a solid option to get. So you got Derek Carr. Then moving on, we got Darren Waller. Had a very good season this year, was his best fantasy season by far, had 171 fantasy points. Some of his best games had 16 points against the Saints in Week 2. He had 14 points against the Chiefs in Week 11. He had 32 against the Jets in Week 13. He had 200 receiving yards and 2 touchdowns in that game. And he had 21 points against the Chargers in Week 15. And he had 17 points against the Broncos in Week 17. The guy's a fantasy monster at the tight end spot. There are a couple games where he really didn't do anything, but you know what? I think the good outweighs the bad with this guy, and I think that when he's available and you need a tight end, you got to go and get him. Don't make the mistake that my friend made where, he was on auto pick. He ended up having George Kittle and Darren Waller, and he ended up trading Darren Waller, and that ended up, messing him up because George Kittle was hurt for pretty much the whole season, and, he didn't have another tight end. Well, he had Hunter Henry, I believe, but Hunter Henry is not Darren Waller, so yeah, that wasn't really a smart trade on his part. But needless to say, Darren Waller is definitely going to be a top 3 tight end in fantasy this year if, he stays healthy. He's a guy, like I said, should be taken 3rd, 4th round probably, and should have another productive season. So let's move on to kind of somebody that I don't think I ever talked about on the show yet, and that is Henry Ruggs. Now, only had 58 fantasy points last year, played in 13 games last year. His best game really came against the Chiefs where he had 17.8 points, had 118 receiving yards and a touchdown in that game, and that was in the Week 5 contest. And did have the game-winning touchdown against the Jets in Week 13. He had 12 points in that contest. So yeah, those are really his only good games. But the reason why I have him here is now Nelson Aguilar is gone, and that was like the top wide receiver for the Raiders last year, arguably. Tyrell Williams is now on the Lions, even though he didn't play at all last year. So this is the year that Henry Ruggs steps up and is that number 1 option in Vegas. And I think that, hopefully for his sake he does well. I outside of Darren Waller, who else is on this offense, that I could really think of? I guess Hunter Renfrow, but, he should take on a much larger role this year, Henry Ruggs. And I think that if he stays healthy, he could be productive. He showed flashes. He's got the speed. Let's see what he does. I think that, he's probably going to be taken a lot later in a lot of drafts. But, I think he could potentially be a guy that you pick up off the waiver wire, or be a bench player, be a backup for, just in case anybody gets hurt, So that's my thoughts on Henry Ruggs. We'll see what happens with that. And then, of course, you got Josh Jacobs. I talked about him earlier in the show. I talked about the inconsistency that he sometimes, succumbs to, in some games, when he has a good game and then he does really bad. And I've talked to people that weren't really pleased about that when it came to Josh Jacobs. But listen, I think he's a solid number 2 running back. I think he's a guy that's going to get taken in the 3rd, 4th round again. I know Kenyon Drake is there. And, let's see what happens with that. That's going to be an interesting situation. But you know what? If Josh Jacobs plays and is effective, he's a good running back. So I think he's going to be a solid number 2 running back once again. So that's my thoughts on him. So, those are the Raiders players that I think you should draft. And then moving on, you got the Kansas City Chiefs. Now, it's pretty obvious on who you should take. I would throw Clyde Edwards-Helaire in there as well. I talked about him early on in the show. But really looking through the Chiefs players, obviously the big 3, Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill. I think those are the guys you must have. And then really outside of that, that's probably it. I don't really see DeMarcus Robinson or McCole Hardman being guys that you'd want to take. If you're playing in deeper leagues, that's a different story. They could definitely be waiver wire pickups, in case Tyreek Hill gets injured. But, I don't really see me taking any of these guys. Now that Sammy Watkins is gone, I think that gives them more targets. We'd have to wait and see how they do with an increased role, with Sammy Watkins leaving to go play for the Ravens. But, like I said, I'd probably, stick to, leaving them on the waiver wire. I don't know. That's just me. But other than that, talking about the guys that you most definitely should take, Travis Kelce, who I rant and rave about, say, he could be a first-round pick. I definitely would consider taking him if he's available to me. If I have a late first-round pick. Because looking at Kelce's numbers, he had 207 fantasy points this year, or in 2020. That was his best by far. Was super consistent, getting double-digit fantasy points pretty much every week. I mean, the only game that he didn't do good was against the Broncos. He only had 3 points in that game, but that was a snow game, That was a game where the teams had to run the ball more. I think that he could be even better this year. He's a top tight end. He's going to be the number one tight end taken off the board in fantasy, and I anticipate that he's going to have another great season. I talked about Edwards-Helaire. I think he could be solid, with the additions that the Chiefs made in the offensive line, and hopefully they run the football a little bit more, and maybe he'll be effective because of that. The people, that are concerned about him are worried about his size and stuff like that. He did have a couple of flashes, a couple of good games. They just got to give him the football more and be more consistent at running the football, and I think he could be a solid number 2 option at the running back spot. Tyreek Hill, I think, is a wide receiver 1. Definitely is going to be a second-round pick this year, second or third-round pick in fantasy. Did have his best fantasy season, had 241.9 fantasy points, which was the most of his career. Back in 2018, he had 241 fantasy points, so he was 0.9 better in 2020. And some of his best games, he had 21 points against the Jets in Week 8, 24 against the Panthers in Week 9, and he had that crazy game against the Bucs where he had 200 yards in the first quarter, 269 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns, had 44 points in that game, had 23 points against Miami in Week 14. He was really good in 2020. He wasn't injured a lot. I think he only missed one game, I want to say. Yes, he did miss one game, and I think that was, it was the game where they sat all their starters in Week 17. So he didn't miss a game due to injury, which is very encouraging. Like I said, I think he's going to be a second, third-round pick. Somebody you're definitely going to want to have on your team. The thing you got to worry about is the boomer bust aspect of him, because he does have the tendency to do that. But I think it's really hard to pass on him, especially when he plays in this offense. And then, of course, you have Patrick Mahomes. I don't think he's going to be the best fantasy QB this year, but I think he's going to be top 5 once again. And, if he's there and you need a quarterback, definitely take him, because he's still one of the best in the league. I mean, he's still the best quarterback in the league, but I think in terms of fantasy numbers, he's not going to be the best. But like I said, going to be top 5. So, yeah, that is my draft analysis of the AFC West. So with that, we are going to take our final break of the show. When we come back, we are going to talk about the top 10 running backs entering 2021 post-NFL draft, post-NFL free agency. So stick around. We'll be right back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football, from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
All right, and we're back here on the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. For the last segment of the show, we're going to talk about the top 10 running backs going into 2021, post-NFL draft, post-NFL free agency. So let's get right into it. So at number 10, see, I was struggling with this here because I kind of have Joe Mixon and David Montgomery down here as like a combination thing. Because, Joe Mixon, when he's healthy, he's a very dynamic running back. And David Montgomery was very productive towards the end of last year. And Joe Mixon was dealing with injuries last year that, reduced him to only 6 games last year. So I'd probably put David Montgomery slightly ahead of Joe Mixon just because I think that the Bears have a slightly better offensive line than the Bengals. I have more confidence in their offensive line and their run blocking than I do in the Bengals. And it's just the concern of Joe Mixon coming back from injury. So I'd probably give the slight edge to David Montgomery at number 10 on this list. David Montgomery last year had 210 fantasy points. Some of his best games, I'm just really going to talk about what he did in really the last couple of games of the season. He had 20 against Green Bay in Week 12, 23 against the Lions in Week 13, 21 against Houston in Week 14, 28 against Minnesota in Week 15, 18 against Jacksonville in Week 16, and then had 19 in Week 17 against Green Bay. Now, some of these teams, the defenses aren't really good, but you know what? Hey, David Montgomery showed something last year. So, maybe that's going to translate to this year as well. So we'll see what happens with that. Listen, not to say that Joe Mixon's not going to be good. I think he's going to be really good this year. And as we get, closer to the season and, once we get into the season and, we see how these guys are going to do, maybe the list will change. I'll definitely, this is not the end all be all, listen, I'm not I don't really like doing rankings lists, but that's really all I've been doing on the show. But, this is what I think, and like I said, it's not my end all be all, it is what it is, so I have David Montgomery slightly ahead of Joe Mixon just because of the offensive line and the fact that Joe Mixon's coming back from injury. So at number 9, you got Austin Eckler, who I have talked about a couple of times on this show. Only played in 10 games last year, like I talked about, had 111 fantasy points. It was a down year for him, to say the least. I think he's going to have a productive season as long as he stays healthy. Like I talked about, he's a PPR stud, and that's really where his value is going to be the best in fantasy. And especially in this offense, he's going to get a lot of touches. And he is the number 1 running back. So, that along with the fact that he's a good pass-catching running back, I think that's really going to help him a lot. But like I said, he's just got to stay healthy. I have him above David Montgomery and Joe Mixon just because he's part of a more explosive offense. I think the Bengals offense is probably going to be a little bit better than Chicago's if Joe Burrow does play. But like I said, I think that, out of the 3 running backs that I've now just talked about, with Eckler and Mixon and Montgomery, I think that Eckler is part of the more explosive offense. And, him being a pass-catching running back definitely does help. So I have him at number 9. At number 8, you got Aaron Jones, the running back for the Green Bay Packers. I think he's going to take a little bit of a step back in productivity this year just because I think the offensive line is going to be a little bit worse than what it was last year. The Packers did lose Corey Linsley in the offseason. I don't know. I just feel like Aaron Jones' productivity is going to be down a little bit. I think his 2019 season, I think, was his peak. I just think now because he's a year older, I don't know. That's just me. He did have a lot of good games last year. His best game came against the Lions in Week 2 where he had 41 points in that game, rushed for 168 rushing yards, and 2 touchdowns in that game. And he had a receiving touchdown as well. And then, of course, other games that he did well, he had 130 yards against the Eagles and a touchdown, and he had 20 points in that contest, and he had 21 against Carolina in Week 15, rushed for 145 rushing yards in that contest, and had a touchdown in that game as well. He's a productive running back. I think what makes him go lower, even lower on this list, and maybe even out of the top 10, is if Aaron Rodgers is not the quarterback. I think if Aaron Rodgers is not the quarterback, then I think Aaron Jones' draft stock goes down. I feel like he could be a first-round pick, end of the first round, but I feel like he's still going to be a second, third-round pick in fantasy. Not to say he's not going to do bad. I think he'll still be productive. I just think, I don't know, for me, I feel like his production is going to go a little bit lower this year just because of now, not to say he's an old man now, but, now he's starting to get up there in age. And, we're seeing with running backs, teams move off of running backs really quickly, in case they, when they show signs of wear and tear. I don't think Aaron Jones is at that point yet, but I don't know. Just for me, I feel like his production is going to go down a little bit, but we'll have to wait and see. So Aaron Jones there. Then at number 7, we got Ezekiel Elliott. Last year, according to Pro Football Focus, Dallas's offensive line was 27th in the league last year. And not only that, Ezekiel Elliott definitely wasn't himself last year. I've talked a lot on this show about the fact that, the offensive line was banged up. That really has a lot to do with the fact why I was at the bottom of the league last year. It was banged up. Tyron Smith was out, La'el Collins was out, Zach Martin was out, and hopefully all those guys come back healthy this year. You got that. Then, of course, Dak Prescott going down, like I've talked about a million times on the show. You had him going down. I think with a healthier offensive line and a healthy quarterback, Ezekiel Elliott is going to be productive this year. The other thing that I always say is, he's not going to be what he was in 2016, and I think everybody understands that. I still think he's going to be a first-round pick just because this Dallas offense can be really good this year. Listen, they could put up a lot of garbage points, but who cares? In fantasy, you love that. You want that for your team. So, let's kind of go through Ezekiel Elliott's stats. You could kind of see, how Dak Prescott being out and the offensive line being banged up really affected him last year. This was the lowest amount of fantasy points he scored in a year, for his career. And he only averaged 11.4 fantasy points per game. He had 171 fantasy points last year. The first 5 games, he was great. 24 points against the Rams, 16 against the Falcons. He had a couple of fumbles in that game. He fumbled twice, so he could have had 20 points in that game. Only had 11 against Seattle, but he had a touchdown in that game. 12 against the Browns, and then he had 22 against the Giants in Week 5, and that's when that was when Dak got hurt. And then after that, he failed to reach 20 points in any game. So I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Dak Prescott, getting hurt really affected him. Because we got to see what Dak Prescott was without Ezekiel Elliott. He was really bad without Ezekiel Elliott. When Ezekiel Elliott got suspended back in 2017, Dak Prescott was one of the worst quarterbacks in the league when Ezekiel Elliott got suspended. Now we got to see what Ezekiel Elliott looks like without Dak Prescott, and he was terrible. He was really bad. He went from being, a top running back to, being a flex option, really. But like I said, I think with Dak coming back in a healthy offensive line, I think Zeke could still be productive and be a top running back in this league. And in fantasy, I don't think you're going to see, him, drop 20, 30 points every single week. But I think he's going to give you roughly 14 to, 15 every week. But he will have those good performances because, if they go up against an opponent that's, not very good, he's going to benefit from that. I think they have a terrible matchup in Week 1 against the Bucs. I think that is a terrible team to open up against. I don't think Zeke's going to have a good game in that contest. But we'll have to wait and see. But I think Zeke is going to be productive this year. You got to be a little worried about him because he's another running back that's getting up there in age, and the wear and tear might finally be getting to him as well. So we'll have to wait and see. But for me, I think Zeke's going to be productive just because of a healthy offensive line and Dak Prescott coming back. And hopefully Dak comes back healthy. So then at number 6, you got Saquon Barkley. Now, I probably have him a little bit higher than Ezekiel Elliott just because he's younger than Ezekiel Elliott. But, then again, you got Saquon coming back from an ACL tear, which is not a great injury to be coming back from. Now, last year, he only had 9.4 fantasy points in 2 games, which is not very good. The previous 2 seasons, 2018 had 294.8 fantasy points, and in 2019 he had 192.1 fantasy points. So that's what he did in his first 2 seasons with the Giants before 2020. I think Saquon's going to have a good season. I think the Giants' offensive line is obviously not like Dallas's offensive line. At least Dallas's offensive line in years past. I think if Dallas's offensive line is healthy, I think it's going to be better than the Giants. But this is probably the best offensive line that Saquon Barkley is going to be running behind. And I don't really know how you would take that. The Giants are putting a lot of stock in the young guys that they've brought in, that they've drafted over the past couple of seasons. And listen, they did get better as the season went along last year. And, I talked about it before. The one game I remember that Saquon played in, was the Steelers game. The full game that he played in was against the Steelers. And literally every time he got the ball, he was stopped in the backfield. I mean, he could not do anything. That offensive line was so bad that night. It was terrible. Saquon could not do anything. I think he's going to be able to find some holes. And stuff that he's criticized over is the fact that, he has one big run in a lot of his games, and that inflates his stats. And everyone's like, wow, he rushed for over 100 yards. But it's like, well, it's because of that one big run that he had. Other than that, he's, really didn't do much. That's the one complaint I think a lot of people had with him. He's not a very big guy either, other than his quads, but hey, I think he's still going to be productive. He's going to be a dynamic playmaker for this offense. I just think that the Giants offensively are going to be a really good team. I think that Daniel Jones should have a good season. And if the Giants are a good offense, play action could work well for this team, with the weapons that they added and with Saquon coming back. I think play action will open up a lot of opportunities for Saquon. It's just stuff like that. I can't see Saquon not doing well in this offense. I really think it all depends on the offensive line. If the offensive line can't block, then he's not going to do anything. But I think he's going to be motivated, and I think he's going to have a good season. But I think he's going to fall a little bit in fantasy drafts. I think he's going to be taken more towards the end of the first round, maybe the second round. But I think he's going to be taken, like I said, towards the end of the first round. I'm not as high on Saquon as a lot of other people are, but I still think he's going to be very productive. So Saquon's the next running back on this list. Then ahead of him at number 5 is Nick Chubb. Now, I think Nick Chubb is going to be a top 5 pick this year. Now, that's, I would say, is a little bit controversial just because of the fact that he shares touches with Kareem Hunt. But I feel like, across a full season, he's going to be really good. I mean, think about it. When you look at his stats from 2019, in 16 games, had 219 fantasy points. Then in only 12 games this year, he had 191 fantasy points. He rushed for over 1,000 yards, averaged 5.6 yards per carry, had 12 rushing touchdowns. This was only in 12 games last year, sorry. And, some of his best games, he had 25 points in week 2 against the Bengals. He had 23 against Washington in week 3. He had 18 against the Texans in week 10, 23 against Jacksonville in week 12. He had 16 against the Titans in week 13 with a touchdown, 22 against Baltimore in week 14. He had 2 touchdowns in that contest. He's very consistent. He's a very consistent running back, and that's what I really like about him. Is he's very consistent. He's always getting in double digits. The Browns' offensive line was top 3 in the league according to Pro Football Focus. With all of that, I just think that Nick Chubb is going to have a really good season. I think he's going to be a top 5 pick, possibly. I just think that, when you look at his body of work, especially last year, only playing in 12 games and putting up those numbers, if you could do that across, a 17-game season now, now that I, think about it, he's going to be really good, so, and the fact that, Kevin Stefanski is able to, evenly share the touches between him and Kareem Hunt, they're able to make it work. I think Chubb, regardless, I think Chubb is going to, be the guy that's going to be getting those red zone touches, and that's going to give him more fantasy points, So I just think he's the more consistent back. He's got a better offensive line. I just feel like he's going to have possibly his best season yet. So I got Chubb at number 5. At number 4, we got Alvin Kamara. Now, the reason why Alvin Kamara is up here is because just, the fact that he's a PPR stud. I think that regardless of the quarterback spot, doing these rankings now, he's going to be productive. He's the lead running back now. Obviously, Mark Ingram is gone now. Well, he's been gone for a couple of years now. Latavius Murray is not what Mark Ingram was with the Saints, but he's still a serviceable running back. And Alvin Kamara had the most fantasy points, of his career in 2020. And, of course, I've been doing based off of standard numbers. He had 294 fantasy points and, played in 15 games in 2020. Some of his best games, 29 points against Vegas in Week 2, 31 against Green Bay in Week 3. Was really consistent pretty much in every game. The only time he hit single digits was in Week 12 against Denver, which was a very odd game. I talked about it a little bit before earlier in the show when Denver, had all their quarterbacks out and they had to have a guy just come in and start off the practice squad. So, that was an interesting game. But other than that, Kamara was very consistent last year. Obviously had that monster game in Week 16. He had 53 points, 6 touchdowns in that game. That was the Christmas game. He was very consistent. And you know what? Drew Brees, he missed a lot of time due to the rib injury that he sustained against San Francisco that left him out for a couple games. I think regardless of who the quarterback is, I think Kamara is still going to be productive, and I still think he's going to be, a top 5 pick possibly in fantasy. So, I have him at number 4. At number 3, I got Derrick Henry. Like I talked about earlier, the guy's a bowling ball. Like I keep saying, you got to worry about, what you saw in the playoffs against the Ravens was concerning. But hey, he was coming off of his best season. Had 314 fantasy points, rushed for over 2,000 yards. I've talked about that. I went through all the games that he did really good in. He had a couple of 200-yard performances. Listen, I think he's still a top 3 pick. He is going to have a couple of games where he doesn't do much, but you know what? I think, again, he's another guy. The good outweighs the bad. The Titans, this is going to be an interesting year for them. They've had a good couple of seasons now. With Ryan Tannehill being the quarterback, and I think Derrick Henry has definitely benefited from better QB play. But this could be the year where the Titans take a little bit of a step back. I still think that Derrick Henry is a solid number 1 running back. I think he's still going to have a very good season. I don't think he's going to rush for 2,000 yards again, but I could be completely wrong. But I think that he's still going to have a very good season, and it is hard to contain him on a consistent basis just because of how massive this guy is. So I would have him at number 3. Then at number 2, Dalvin Cook. I think he's, what puts him ahead of Derrick Henry is not only the consistency, but the pass catching ability that he brings to the table. Some of his best games from 2020, 20 points in Week 1 against Green Bay, 23.9 against the Titans in Week 3, 26.6 against Houston in Week 4, 46.6 against Green Bay in Week 8, 37.2 against the Lions in Week 9, 20 points against Dallas in Week 11, 21 against Chicago in Week 15, and he had the most fantasy points of his career in 293.8 in 2020 in only 14 games. He hasn't played a full season, in his entire career, so if he's able to stay healthy every single week, and not miss any time, those numbers are going to be even better. I think the Vikings, they're going to still be a very good offense, and he's going to be the main reason for that. This offense runs through Dalvin Cook, and when Dalvin Cook is not playing, they suffer because of that. So, I think he's going to have a good season. The Vikings, they addressed the offensive line in the draft. I just think collectively as a team, the Vikings are going to be better than they were last year, and I anticipate Dalvin Cook is going to have another good season. And then at number 1 is Christian McCaffrey. Only played in 3 games last year. He averaged 20-plus points in all 3 games that he played in. I think he's going to have a great season. He's going to have a bounce-back season. I think he is, without question, the number 1 pick. We've seen how he's performed with quarterbacks like Kyle Allen and Will Grier, and a banged-up Cam Newton. So I think he's going to do well with Sam Darnold. Again, he's another guy that's a PPR stud, very good in the passing game. And he's very explosive, running the football. I mean, he's a running back, and he's very explosive with that. A lot of big plays, happen when he's running the football. So I got him at number 1. I think he's going to be the number 1 overall pick. If I have the number 1 overall pick, I'm taking him. I think, coming off of an injury, I'm confident that he will have a bounce-back season. So those are my top 10 running backs of 2021. And listen, the list is going to change as, throughout the season, when guys, come out of nowhere and perform and stuff like that. So, yeah. But this is my list as of right now. This is my updated list of the top 10 running backs. So there you have it. So with that, that is all the time that we have for today. Make sure to subscribe to our social media platforms and write a nice review on our website. We greatly appreciate it. And yeah, that's all the time we got. So I'm Kenneth Gruenfelder signing off from the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network, saying have a good day, and we will see you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.